I'm using simple tools and no technology to make miniature clothing and laundry baskets. The laundry baskets will take some time to shape, so I'm choosing fabrics, and I started with this cross-stitch canvas because I like the pattern and texture. I'm also choosing this tapestry canvas, which is one of my favorite materials. I'll be making a third basket out of this burlap because I like the woven material. I'm using some plastic caps from my trash hoard to help shape one of the baskets. I got these 2 caps from some Dollar Tree glue sticks that were dry from day one, but they'll be making their contribution now. Using 2 of these caps side by side taped together will give me an elongated oval shape of basket. It's a little too long and too narrow, so I'm beefing it up with some aluminum foil. To make my basket a bit more busty, I'm stuffing some Kleenex in the gaps. By filling these voids, I'm making it stronger so I can wrap some fabric tightly around it without crushing the shape. To help my 3 different types of fabric hold its shape, I'm adding some white glue to water. I did not measure the amounts because that's not what we do around here, but this ratio was perfectly adequate in the end. I would guess I used about 1 part glue for 4 parts water, but don't quote me on that. Maybe there's a better tool for this than a wimpy fan brush, but it took me a moment to incorporate all the glue into the water. Once it has a nice uniform milky appearance, I'm submerging a square of my burlap material. I don't want this to take forever to dry, so I'm wringing out the excess. The fabric is damp but not soaking wet, so I wrapped it around my little basket form. I'm helping it hold its shape by using some Dollar Tree clips. Before clipping it, I paid attention to how the lines are lining up to see if I like the pattern to make it look like a woven basket. The cross-stitch canvas fabric was very stiff and I wasn't sure it would work well for this purpose, but it softened up a ton once it was wet. For the next basket, I'm using a Dollar Tree Mod Podge bottle. Making a round basket with a square piece of fabric is not entirely simple, and it took me a moment to figure it out. The best method I found was crossing the fabric on either side so it's flat on the front. I'm using sewing pins on either side to help this hold its shape while it dries. This beautiful 10-count tapestry canvas was the stiffest of them all. This is one of my favorite materials, so I was reluctant trying this experiment on it in case it didn't work. I cut a piece from one of the ragged corners and squeezed out the excess. I'm using the super glue bottle to make another oval basket, but I wanted to slightly taper, so I'm wrapping the bottom of the bottle with some aluminum foil. The fabric has a little bit of give, so I teased it into a pleasing shape, and that's my 3 baskets ready for drying. You can speed up the dry time with a hairdryer, but I left these to themselves while I make some miniature clothing. I'm tracing around a 1/12 scale TV League or Fison action figure doll to get a good idea of what the clothing size should be at this scale. I'm sketching a quick little crop top, but I'm only sketching half of it because I can fold it over and trace this shape on the other side to make sure it's a mirror image. To make a pattern for pants, I traced the shape of the doll's lower body, folded it in half, and cut out the inside of the thigh. I recently had surgery, so I'm using the strap from my surgical gown as a substitute for denim since it would be pretty thick at this scale. I'm folding the strap in half so I can trace half of the pattern onto the strap, so when I cut out both sides of the pants and unfold them, they'll still be attached in the middle just like my pattern. Adding lots of little details will make these a lot more realistic and interesting, so I'm starting by adding 2 little pockets. I'm using Beacon 3-in-1 glue, which is very similar to Fabri-Tac. It's an acetone-based glue that grabs really quickly. Some people call it cold hot glue. I added the little piece to the middle that conceals the zipper and tried to add some stitching to the pockets using my best white gel pen. The gel pen isn't working at all, so I'm switching to using some paint and a paintbrush. I'm painting on fading and some more details to give these jeans dimension. I'm not sure what surgical gowns are made of, but they're sort of like a papery fabric and it was absorbing the paint decently. You'll notice it goes on a lot whiter and then dries a lot more subtle. I glued 2 rectangles to the bottom and now I'm trimming them to be the same size as one another so it looks like there are little cuffs on the bottom of these jeans. I have some more details to add, but I'm adding a back for now. We won't be seeing the back of these pants and they're not wearable, so I'm adding some dimension by adding a second layer the easiest way I know how. I'm folding over the very edge of the strap and using more of my acetone-based glue to glue it on the outside of the pant leg. This material is pretty thin, but it still didn't leak through to the front. It grabbed really quickly, so I cut a strip the same height as the pair of pants to get rid of a lot of the bulk so I can fold it into a tube and glue it on the other side. It's just a tube glued onto the back, but from the front it looks dimensional like real jeans. It looks a lot more realistic than the right side, which is still flat. I added a pant leg to either side, and now I'm adding some tearing using an X-Acto knife. I'm creating the look of torn jeans by cutting superficially through the first layer of fabric and using the tip of my knife to scrape at the fibers. This material was pretty weird and fuzzy, so I used some scissors to help the tears along. To emphasize the holes and mimic the look of white threads coming through the edges, I'm using some white paint on a skinny paintbrush. I'm creating a balanced look, but I'm not worrying about making it perfectly symmetrical since tears are never that perfect. I've seen Little Gretchen's workshop use nail studs like this multiple times, so I ran to Temu and got my own. I'm using one of the larger gold studs to add a button to the jeans. Before I add more details, I'm adding some stitching using some full-strength white paint. This is the detail I was trying to create with my white gel pen, which wasn't showing up. I used the paint to emphasize a couple of belt loops I never told you about, and added some around a lot of the other details, but not on the inside of the legs. I'm using the tiniest size of my brass nail studs to add grommets to the pockets. I originally planned to cut these in pieces to add them to the laundry baskets, but that's not happening. I have a nice big bag of fabric scraps I bought from my local quilting shop. I don't do any quilting, but word on the street was they sell small bits of fabric for cheap, so I paid them a visit. I'll be using lots of the little scraps to fill my laundry basket, but right now I'm using this white fabric and my pattern I made earlier to make a miniature shirt. I'm laying the piece of paper on the pattern of the fabric I like and keeping it attached at the shoulders so I can cut this out in one piece. I will not be sewing, so to create a hem on the bottom, I'm folding it over and gluing it. Next, I'm addressing the sleeves by cutting a tab in each of the armpits and folding over and gluing the edge. All of these folds will be glued so they don't fray and there's a nice finished edge. Lastly, I'm folding in the sides and gluing those as well. I'm folding all 4 sides. To make these edges tidier, I'm cutting across the corner to get rid of some of the bulk before folding it. All of these tidy edges are folded and glued, so now I'm folding the shirt in half to glue it. For realism, I left the bottom of the shirt and the sleeves opened and added glue around the top of the sleeve and on the sides. The neck opening is still unfinished, so I'm adding a collar using some lace. I'm using multiple pieces from this one little bit of lace, so I'm starting by cutting off the bottom. I carefully cut out the petals of this flower, which will make a great collar for the top of my shirt. I cut out this piece to add buttons to, but I dropped it on my rug and never found it, so don't get emotionally attached. I got a bunch of these silicone cupcake liners from Goodwill by the pound and paid only $2 a pound for these, so they were essentially free. I say they were practically free because they're so lightweight. I like using them for messy applications like this where I'm dyeing my bits of lace using some watered down acrylic paint. The white doesn't contrast very well with the white shirt, so I'm dyeing these gray so I can paint them silver. My thought process behind dyeing these pieces was to add a base coat like I do when I paint anything else silver. Maybe it would have worked better if I had used black paint instead of gray, but this didn't make much of a difference, so I would skip this step. Let's stop screwing around and actually add some color to these pieces. I'm using some cheap acrylic paint and a produce tray and pouncing the paint onto the front and back. I'm adding the lace trim at the top with a little gap in between so it looks like a collar and adding this long strip to the bottom in the sleeves. I attached the collar with some overhang so I can glue it on the back. Now that we've emphasized the subtle pattern on the shirt, let's add some buttons. I used wood glue to attach some silver buttons and painted them black. This shirt promotes unrealistic beauty standards because of how tiny the waist is, but I still think it's cute. To make a skirt, I'm tracing the top part of my pants pattern onto the wrong side of some fabric. I made 2 of these pieces and folded the seam inward so the right side is facing out. To create a tidier hem, I cut a square off of the end of each of the seams before folding and gluing them. I folded the seam crooked, but my trademark is good enough, so we're moving on. The top and the bottom are nicely hemmed, so now I'm placing the right sides of the fabric together and gluing the edges. You could also sew this, but I really hate sewing. This is normally the most satisfying part where you'd have your great reveal, but unfortunately the fabric I chose is way too thick, so when I turned to the skirt right side out, I got a very weird skinny tube. This looks like crap, so I'm really happy I didn't bother sewing. My plan was to repeat the process using thinner fabric. For the second skirt, I hemmed the top and bottom properly, but completely forgot to glue the wrong sides together. Instead of starting over, I'm simply cutting off the edges as tightly to the glue line as I can, and this was very successful, so whatever. I cut out a long rectangle of the same fabric and hemmed the top and the bottom using some glue. I'm creating a long ruffle using a sewing needle and some thread. I don't normally sew, but I don't really consider this sewing. I believe this is called a long running stitch, and I'm just creating it by putting the needle through the front and the back of the fabric. Once my thread is through the whole piece, I can pull it to create a ruffle. I pulled the ruffle so it was too tight, and now I am spreading it out in a uniform way. To secure this size and shape, I fold it over the ends and I'm quickly whip stitching them together so they don't budge. This actually goes faster than waiting for glue to dry. I made this ruffle so it fits nicely into the bottom of the skirt. To attach the ruffle, I'm making some space at the bottom of the skirt and added a bunch of acetone-based glue on the inside and pressed it together, making sure not to glue it shut. I added some paper towel on the inside for some more dimension, and I could not be happier with how cute this turned out. For my final bit of clothing, I'm using some cut-up bedsheet to make a folded white collared shirt. I did a terrible job making a folded rectangle and I have to fix it later, so I won't give you too much instruction on this part. I'm making a really simple collar for the shirt by adding a bunch of glue to a folded piece of the sheet. I added an excessive amount of the beacon 3-in-1, so when I fold it and trim the excess off, it won't fray. As an afterthought, I'm adding this tab on the back so it'll be easier to add to the folded piece I made. I trimmed it to fit and added it in between two of the folds. It's really easy to turn this into a collar by trimming the excess and hot gluing the ends down. What's a collared shirt without a pocket? So I'm making a very simple one by gluing some paper to more of the sheet. This paper will give the sheet some structure and keep it from fraying, as well as providing me a pattern to cut along. This tiny pair of underpants is just about done, but I'm adding some extra fabric to the top to give it a folded look. I glued this pocket a bit too high, so I ended up ripping it off and lowering it, but this is how I attached it. I'm adding some buttons to this button down, but this time I'm using glass seed beads attached with some wood glue. The holes are a dead giveaway, so I'm taking more of the wood glue and filling them in. I really like using common items in unexpected ways, but I hate when there's something very unrealistic like a giant hole in the middle of a button. You can leave it as is or paint this wood glue white once it dries. My glued fabric has been drying on the forms for about a day and a half, so I'm finally giving them a trim. I don't know how long it actually took for these to dry, but you can definitely speed it up with a hairdryer or a heat gun. Just be aware that you may be able to dry the outside of the basket, but have to take the form out to carefully dry the inside. Mine had been air drying long enough that the inside of the basket was also dry. I didn't think I used very much glue, but this is still nice and strong, so I can trim it to the correct shape. To tidy up the super ragged top edge, I'm braiding some of the same fibers I got from the burlap. This will give it a really nice finished look and keep the burlap from unraveling over time. Burlap fiber is very similar to jute, where it has all of these little fibers hanging off of it. I'm very carefully using a lighter to burn these off. I'm focusing on getting rid of most of them, but if I tried to burn every single one of them off, I would be left with a ton of black dots. To keep the rope from unraveling once I'm cutting it into pieces, I soaked it with some glue and sped the drying along with a hairdryer. Before I add the top edge, I'm gluing in a handle on either side of the basket using some more of that Fabri-Tac type beacon-in-1 glue. I knotted each of the ends to help keep it from unraveling, and I'm holding it in place with some Dollar Tree clips. I'll come back to that, but I'm getting started on my second basket. Before I completely remove this from the form, I'm reinforcing the folds with some hot glue. Since hot glue cures so quickly, I can remove this from the form and trim it to shape right away. These layers are really tough, so I used a combination of scissors and actually some pliers to get it trimmed. I'll finish both of the previous baskets later, but right now I'm moving on to the tapestry canvas basket. I removed the glue bottle and the aluminum foil before giving it a trim. Like I said, this is one of my favorite materials ever, so I'm keeping all of these scraps because I don't want any of this to go to waste. It's surprisingly strong with exactly the shape I was hoping for. I'm using a tiny bit of my scraps to cut a long skinny piece. I'll be using this piece to make two handles, but I'm cutting the strip all at the same time so both of the handles will be the same size as one another. For interest, I'm hot gluing both of the handles to either side like this. I'm leaning into the boho look of this basket by adding some fringe to trim around the edges. This supposed fringe to trim is actually just the unfinished edge of the tapestry canvas and is normally thrown out. My piece of trim will have a seam, so I'm looking at both sides of the basket to decide which side I like most. I like this because I like the little swoops. After choosing the front of my basket, I glued the seams in the back. The burlap basket has a fold on one side, so this will be the front. I glued the braided trim around the top. At the last minute, I decided to use this thrifted leather shoelace to add some more detail to my canvas basket. This real leather is really thick for 1/12 scale, so I'm using my craft knife to shave it down. I'm laying it flat on my desk and shaving away from me. I did buy a leather skiver off of Temu, but I can't find it, so I'm just using my blade to shave it. Now that this is much thinner, I can use it to make some handles and a border at the top of the basket. To make sure my handles are the same length, I cut them at the same time. I attached all the leather pieces with hot glue and added little rivets. Making these 3 baskets with 3 entirely different looks from different materials didn't take much time at all. Now I'm using more of my scraps of fabric to fill these with dirty laundry. I didn't overthink it and grabbed some various bits of my small pieces of fabric and cut them into squares. I wanted a nice variety of colors to add some more interest to my dirty baskets of laundry. To save time and material and help give this basket more structure, I'm stuffing the bottom with some tissue paper. This pattern's a little bit funky, so I'm folding the most offensive bits and hot gluing it to the tissue paper. I'm covering it with some various other bits of fabric, making it look like dirty clothing that was stuffed in a basket. I'm figuring out what the front is and making sure that side looks good. A lot of the miniatures I make have one good angle, and that's perfectly fine. Remove any visible hot glue and Bob's your uncle. You can see right through the burlap basket, so I added some of this burgundy fabric underneath the tissue paper to make it look more realistic. To make this look like a sleeve, I hemmed the top using some hot glue and folded it into a small tube. You run the risk of burning your fingers, but the easiest way to make scrunched up laundry is to add a bunch of hot glue to the back and smush it together. I filled the entire burlap basket with pieces like this. My absolute favorite basket, the tapestry canvas basket, is receiving a bunch of clean folded clothing. I'm using this weird tubular skirt, so it wasn't a complete waste of time making it. I decided to use my little sleeve glued to this square of fabric. I never measured, so I had to cut the bottom off of this and pull it taut, remove a button, and all kinds of jazz to get it to fit to the basket. Consider joining my Patreon either as a free member or as a paying member for $3 a month. Watch this video next if you'd like to see me make more dollhouse miniatures from scratch.